If your Jamaican surname is Campbell, Gordon, Stewart, McKenzie, Grant, Fraser, McIntosh, Murray, Douglas, Forbes, Crawford, Hamilton, or one of dozens of other names that sound as if they belong in the Scottish Highlands, you may have wondered the same thing. Why does a Jamaican family have a Scottish name? For some families, the answer may involve a Scottish ancestor. For others, the name may lead to a plantation owner, an estate manager, a colonial official, a church record, or a surname chosen and carried forward after slavery. And for many families, the truth may involve more than one of those stories. That is what makes Jamaican surnames so fascinating. A surname can look simple on a birth certificate, but once you follow it backward through Jamaica's history, that one word can lead into migration, slavery, resistance, emancipation, and sometimes a connection stretching all the way across the Atlantic to Scotland. And the scale of that Scottish connection is much larger than many Jamaicans realize. An Open University history overview notes that about 60% of the surnames in one Jamaican telephone directory were Scottish in origin. Think about that for a moment. Jamaica is more than 4,000 miles from Scotland. The climate is different, the landscape is different, and the majority of Jamaica's population descends primarily from Africans brought to the island through the Atlantic slave system. So how did names associated with Scotland become so deeply embedded in Jamaican families? To understand that, we have to go back to 1655. That was the year England seized Jamaica from Spain. The takeover began a new colonial era, and over the following decades, Britain transformed Jamaica into one of the most valuable plantation colonies in the Atlantic world. Sugar became enormously profitable, but building that economy required labor on a brutal scale. Africans were forcibly transported to Jamaica and enslaved on plantations across the island. At the same time, Europeans also arrived, and among them were Scots. The first Scots did not all arrive as wealthy plantation owners. According to the National Library of Jamaica, some of the earliest Scottish arrivals in the mid-17th century were prisoners of war sent to Jamaica as indentured servants. More Scots came later. Some were connected to the failed Scottish colony at Darien in Panama. Another wave followed the defeat of the Jacobite rising in the 1740s. Others came voluntarily, looking for work, opportunity, land, or wealth. By 1750, according to the National Library of Jamaica, Scots may have made up roughly 1/3 of Jamaica's white population. That is the first important part of the story. There were simply a lot of Scots in colonial Jamaica, but their influence grew beyond their numbers. Many Scots became doctors, lawyers, bookkeepers, merchants, attorneys, estate managers, and eventually plantation owners. Those jobs placed Scottish men inside the machinery of the colonial economy. A young Scotsman might arrive without a fortune, work as a bookkeeper on an estate, become an overseer or attorney, build commercial relationships, acquire property, and sometimes become an owner himself. And wherever those men went, their surnames went with them. Gordon, Grant, McKenzie, Fraser, Forbes, Crawford, Stewart, McIntosh. Names that had existed in Scotland for generations began appearing on Jamaican estates, legal documents, property records, church registers, maps, and eventually inside Jamaican families. You can even see the Scottish imprint on the landscape. Jamaica has places with names such as Aberdeen, Auchenbreck, Caledonia, Clydesdale, Dalvey, Dunkeld, Roxburgh, Stewarton, and Tulloch. These were not random coincidences. Scottish migrants were naming Jamaican properties and communities after places and families they knew across the Atlantic. There is another clue many people overlook: the parish. A surname becomes far more useful when you combine it with a location. If your family has carried the same Scottish-looking name in Westmoreland for generations, that is a different research problem from a family with the same name in Portland, St. Elizabeth, or St. Andrew. Why? Because Scottish settlement, estates, and property ownership were not distributed evenly across the island. The place names themselves give us hints. In St. Elizabeth, there is Aberdeen, named by a Scotsman, Alexander Forbes. In Westmoreland, Auchenbreck was associated with John Campbell. In St Andrew, Papine was owned in the 18th century by Alexander Grant of Banffshire, Scotland. In Portland, Scottish names survive in places such as Clydesdale and Dumbarton. That does not mean everyone living near one of those places descended from the Scottish person connected to its name. But it tells a researcher where particular Scottish families, properties, and networks once operated. So if your grandmother always said, "Our people are from St. Elizabeth," do not treat that as a minor family detail. Write it down. The parish can be more valuable than the surname. The same is true of an old church, an estate name, a district, or even a family nickname that appears repeatedly across generations. Genealogy becomes stronger when several clues point to the same people, in the same place, at the same time. But this is where the story becomes much more complicated, because finding a Scottish surname in a black Jamaican family does not tell you by itself exactly how that surname entered the family. One common explanation says that formerly enslaved people simply took the surnames of their former owners. Sometimes that happened, but historians who study naming under slavery warn that the reality was much more complicated. During slavery, many enslaved people were recorded with only one name. Plantation owners and officials could assign names for their own administrative purposes. Some records contain African-derived names, others contain biblical, English, classical, or European names. And as emancipation approached and passed, surnames became increasingly common among formerly enslaved people and their descendants. Those surnames were not always the names of former owners. That distinction matters. If your surname is Campbell, you cannot look at the word Campbell and conclude, without evidence, that your ancestor was enslaved by a Campbell. And you also cannot automatically conclude that you have a recent biological connection to Clan Campbell in Scotland. Both possibilities may exist. Neither can be proven from the surname alone. Consider how many different routes a surname could take. The first route is the one most people already know. A Scottish plantation owner, manager, attorney, or other person in authority may have had his surname attached to people associated with an estate, and that surname might later survive as a family name. The second route is biological ancestry. Colonial Jamaica produced a large mixed population under deeply unequal conditions. Relationships between European men and African or Afro-Jamaican women ranged from recognized partnerships to exploitation and sexual violence under slavery. Children born from those encounters could sometimes carry, adopt, or later become associated with European family names. So for some Jamaican families, a Scottish surname may indeed correspond with Scottish ancestry. But even then, the surname alone cannot tell you the circumstances of that ancestry. The third route is voluntary surname adoption. After slavery, a surname became increasingly important in legal records. Marriages, baptisms, property ownership, employment, and the creation of recognized family lines. A person might retain a name already in use, choose a name connected to someone important, adopt a respected name, or select a surname for reasons that are no longer visible in surviving records. The fourth route is community absorption and intermarriage. The National Library of Jamaica gives a particularly interesting example from the 19th century. After emancipation, Scottish settlers were recruited to a settlement at Altamont in Portland. The project struggled badly. Many settlers died from disease, while some survivors became integrated into the nearby Maroon community. The library notes that this process contributed Scottish surnames, including Brodie, Hepburn, Stevenson, Allen, and Christian, to that community. That is a completely different pathway from the simple story of an enslaved person taking an owner's surname. And it shows why Jamaican genealogy can become so difficult. The same Scottish-looking surname can have a completely different history in two Jamaican families. Two people named Gordon may not descend from the same Gordon. Two Campbell families may have acquired the name through entirely different circumstances. One McKenzie line could involve a Scottish biological ancestor. Another McKenzie line could connect to an estate. Another could have adopted the surname after emancipation. And another might combine several of those histories over multiple generations. This is why the documents matter. If you genuinely want to understand what your surname means, you have to move beyond the name itself and start building a chain. Start with yourself, then your parents, then your grandparents. Record full names, nicknames, birthplaces, parishes, occupations, churches, spouses, and approximate dates. Do not jump straight from a modern Jamaican surname to a Scottish clan website. That is one of the easiest ways to create a family story that feels exciting but has no documentary foundation. Instead, move backward one generation at a time. Birth records can identify parents, marriage records can connect family lines, baptismal records can reveal parents, churches, and locations, death records can provide ages and family information. Then, as you move into the 19th century, the record changes. The British colonial slave registers become especially important. Those registers can include names, ages, origins, births, deaths, transfers, and the people who legally claimed ownership of enslaved individuals. A Jamaican register from 1826, for example, records hundreds of enslaved people on a single estate, and some of the individuals already appear with surnames. That matters, because records like these can sometimes allow researchers to move from a family living after emancipation back toward people who were recorded while slavery still existed. But this is also where patience becomes important. Spelling changes. A person may appear under a nickname in one record and a formal name in another. Parish boundaries matter. People move, records disappear, and many enslaved people were denied the kind of family documentation routinely created for free Europeans. Sometimes the trail will stop. That does not mean the family had no history. It means the system that documented property often cared more about recording ownership than preserving the full lives and relationships of the people being owned. And that brings us back to the Scottish surname, because a name like Campbell can mean two very different things depending on which side of the record you are reading. For a Scottish merchant or plantation owner, the surname might connect generations of property, inheritance, status, and written documentation. For an enslaved Jamaican carrying a European name, the surviving record may give only a name, an age, a racial category imposed by officials, and the identity of the person who claimed to own them. One family arrives in the archive with a paper trail stretching backward. The other can appear almost suddenly. That imbalance is one of the reasons Caribbean genealogy is so challenging. But it is also why every successful connection matters. Because when you connect a grandparent to a great-grandparent, then to a baptism, then to a parish, then perhaps to an emancipation-era document or slave register, the surname begins to change. It stops being just a Scottish word attached to a Jamaican person. It becomes a clue, and sometimes the clue leads somewhere unexpected. Maybe your Campbell line does connect to a Scottish Campbell who arrived in Jamaica in the 18th century. Maybe it leads instead to a plantation carrying that name. Maybe DNA reveals European ancestry, but the documentary line points to a different Scottish surname entirely. Maybe your family used the surname only after emancipation, or maybe the records reveal that the story your family has repeated for generations was partly right, but missing half the picture. That is the deeper lesson here. Jamaican identity was not created from one population. It was shaped by Africans from multiple regions, Europeans from Britain and elsewhere, indigenous history, later Asian and Middle Eastern migration, and centuries of interaction under conditions that ranged from voluntary migration to forced enslavement. Scottish influence became one strand inside that larger Jamaican story. It remains visible in place names. It remains visible in institutions. It remains visible in language and culture. And perhaps most visibly of all, it remains in surnames, spoken every day by Jamaicans, who may have no idea how far those names have traveled. So if your surname is Campbell, Gordon, Stewart, McKenzie, Grant, Fraser, McIntosh, Murray, Douglas, Forbes, Crawford, Hamilton, Brodie, Hepburn, or another Scottish name, here is the most important thing to remember. Your surname is not your complete ancestry. It is a starting point. Do not let anyone tell you that the name automatically proves you descend from a Scottish clan, and do not assume it automatically proves your ancestor belonged to a plantation owner with the same surname. The real answer is in the records. Find the parish, find the oldest relative you can document, find the church, find the marriage, find the estate if there is one. Then keep moving backward, because somewhere between Jamaica and Scotland, between freedom and slavery, between the names written by colonial officials and the names families chose to carry forward, there may be a story your family has never heard, and that story may be much more complicated than the surname itself. If you want us to keep following the records behind Caribbean surnames, family lines, lost ancestors, and the histories hidden inside the names we carry, subscribe to Bloodline Explained, because your surname may be only one word, but your bloodline has an entire story.